Thank you so much, Karen, and good afternoon, early evening to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us and for holding space for us today and for this very important webinar. And my name is Dr. Erica Millsaps, as Karen just shared, and I am with Northwestern University and also the Center for Child Trauma Assessment Services and Systems Integration. And I'm so excited to be here. And before I turn it over to Dr. Fehrenbach, I do just want to invite everyone to consider a few community agreements. We recognize that some of the information and the concepts that we will be sharing today may be sensitive, may even be a little uncomfortable, and that's okay. We invite you to lean in and to you have permission to be uncomfortable, but we also want to remind everyone to take as many breaths as you need to throughout our time together, and also take care of yourself, and also to remember that whatever is shared in the chat will be inviting you to share your thoughts, share your questions, share your ideas. They are all valid, they are all appreciated. And so with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Fehrenbach.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Dr. Millsaps. My name is Tracy. Eric and I and a bunch of other folks work at Northwestern University together. We, in different combinations, do webinars for the Early Childhood Professional Learning Center, and we're really, really honored to be asked back. I don't know if any of you joined us for our last webinar, but we've had the privilege of doing this particular webinar once before. We have made an adjustment to the webinar since then because we were told that we put too much into one. And so the center was really lovely and has worked with us, and we will now be doing two webinars. So at the very end of today's webinar, we'll have a slide that advertises our next one, which is, I believe, next week, next Thursday. So as Erica said, we applaud you all for taking the time out of your day or evening to spend with us this evening. These are hard topics, and it is okay to have a number of different perspectives about them. When you show up as a presenter to talk about these topics, there's a whole nother level of anxiety that plays into it because you want to make sure that you're letting everybody feel safe, right, and open and expressing themselves. I like to say that when I come to this topic, I come as the mental health professional that I am. So the examples that I'm providing and the advice that we're giving or the education that we're providing is all really meant to promote mental health and well-being across the spectrum. So we invite you to listen as hard as you like. We're going to be switching back and forth because we know it's hard to be talked at for an hour and a half. We're going to incorporate a couple of videos for you. We've got some reflection questions in there. We would love it if you use the chat. You can use the chat to introduce yourself. You can use the chat to ask questions. You can use the chat to share ideas. We will do our best to read and respond to the chat as we go, but please bear with us if we can't get to everybody. It really depends on how busy you are in the chat, and we do know from past experiences that you all have as much knowledge and as much good advice to share as we do. So please don't hesitate to use it generously and to bring to kind of build a community that's learning from one another here. I think that's all that I wanted to say before we dive in. So I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. We welcome you to Creating Safe Classrooms, Unpacking Identity-Based Trauma. These are the learning objectives for today, two very simple, and then an application. So the first one is really to make sure that we're all on the same page about a number of important concepts, many of which we hear mentioned, but we're not really sure what they mean sometimes. So we're going to introduce the concept of identity-based trauma. We're going to focus specifically on racial trauma, but we're going to cover a number of other terms as well. Secondly, the second part of our webinar is going to be focused on really thinking more about how children who carry minoritized identities, and we'll talk more about what that means, are at increased risk of experiencing identity-based trauma or racial trauma within a classroom setting in particular, because that's our audience today as a group of educators. And then we're going to give you a vignette near the end. We're also going to give you a few reflection questions here and there throughout to really help us kind of hit home some of these In our webinar next week, we will have a more applied discussion about what can be done to both protect and or prevent, excuse me, and help kids who have already experienced identity-based trauma heal. Oh, if you have not had a chance already, there are two other webinars that we did late last year that talk about trauma in general. So the first one is how to recognize trauma or traumatic stress when it's expressed in young children in a classroom setting. That's the one on top there. And the one on the bottom is intervention techniques. So that's where we talk more about what teachers and other school staff can do to make sure that they're as sensitive to possible and responding as supportively as possible to children that do experience traumatic events. If you have not checked these out, we strongly encourage you to do so. And now let's dive in. Okay. So we're going to start with what we're calling part one, a series of important concepts, if you will. So as you can see here, we're going to discuss stress and adversity, identity-based trauma, minority stress, bias, marginalization, and discrimination. The thing that I did not mention in the intro that we did mention last time is that because this webinar is still relatively new, we're especially interested in getting feedback. So if there are concepts that you do not see up here that you really wish were, or at any point during today's conversation, please feel free to go ahead and put those suggestions in the chat as well. You can also use your evaluation at the end of today because Karen does share those with us. So let's talk about stress and adversity in childhood. I think at this point in time, there's a bunch of us who feel like we have heard of the adverse childhood experiences or the ACEs study or the ACEs screen. So we have all become more educated as a society here in the United States that adversity during childhood can have some pretty negative consequences, not only on us during childhood, but lasting longer throughout adulthood. The term stress is interesting, though, when you think about it. As I was preparing for this presentation, it really made me kind of pause and think, how often does the term stress come up about childhood, right? So we know our children sometimes feel scared, or they feel excited, or they feel worried about things. But if I had a 2.5-year-old come up and tell me that I'm really stressed out, I think my tendency as an adult, my first response would be to giggle because I think we forget about the fact that stress is one of the most human experiences that we have, and that it shows up equally within childhood as it does adulthood. So we're going to talk a little bit more about how stress shows up in our body, but first let's make sure we're on the same page by defining it. So the concept of stress in general, and as we're using it today, is the response that our mind and our body has in response to any difficult situation. So most certainly it could be a very, very stressful or difficult situation. And we're going to give you some examples of what those are, but I'm going to use a less difficult situation to kind of hit this home. I don't know if any of you have ever run late for a doctor's appointment. I know I most certainly have. And I have most certainly shown up to said doctor appointment running late to find that there is no spot in the parking lot or no spot in the parking garage, right? At which time I get even more stressed than I was when I arrived, knowing that I was late, right? At that point, a lot of things happen. And again, we're going to talk about those in a moment, but it can be something significant like that. It can be slamming our toe in the door. It can be a number of different things that provoke a stress response. The thing to be aware of right now is that it's something that we all experience on a daily basis and that it's not the end of the world. In fact, if you look at the second bullet from the bottom, you'll see that we've got a note there saying a little bit of stress is good. And that's because there's a lot of research out there that shows us if we go out into the world to do the things we need to do, whether they're our hobbies, whether they are our careers, whether it's parenting, whether it's taking care of someone else, having no stress whatsoever generally makes us perform more poorly than if we have a little bit of stress or the right amount of stress. So we're not trying to tell everybody that you need to walk through the world with no stress at all, but we're trying to paint this full picture of it's something that's very normal and even helpful in small amounts. But when it builds up over time or when it's maintained for too long, then we do see it have pretty serious consequences. So that takes us to our next slide, which is quite busy. So bear with me. I'm going to talk you through it. This is a diagram of what the stress response system looks like. So we're going to start at the left top and we're going to go a little bit at a time. When we encounter any situation in our life that provokes stress as we perceive it, so it's distressing for us, it's more difficult than we want it to be, there's a part of our brain, the amygdala, that kind of jumps in and takes over. So it starts by releasing a couple of different chemicals. Adrenaline and cortisol are the two that are represented on the slide here. Unfortunately, adrenaline and cortisol then result in us having less clear thinking, less ability to make good decisions, and our memory being impaired. So if I put myself back in that parking garage and I'm stressed and I'm going around and I see somebody pull out and I can tell by looking at it that it's not going to be, it's too small for my car. That's why the person pulled out when I did, is not parking there. Because I'm stressed and I'm not thinking as clearly and my decision making is impaired, I might go ahead and waste some more time trying to get into it. The other thing that these hormones do to our body, especially if they're there for a little while, is they create a sense of irritability, sometimes make us think a bit irrationally, and make us feel as though we're much more easily overwhelmed than we would otherwise be. Stress, the number one actually endorsed symptom of stress when you survey professionals are tend to be digestive issues. And so digestive issues can be a number of different things. It can be just feeling sick to your stomach or nauseous. It can be problems with digestion. It can be constipation. Regardless, our gut is normally one of the first times that we can recognize that stress is having a negative impact on us. If you move to the right part of the screen over there, it talks about some other parts of our body. So up there at the top, it says breathing becomes rapid and shallow. And I think that's a bit of a tricky, it's written there tricky because it makes you think of how you might act after you go for a run. But the truth is that when we're stressed, it's oftentimes that other people can't notice. We're not panting, but we're not breathing normally either. We're not doing what we need to re-regulate our body. So our breathing does become more rapid. It does become more shallow, but it's not noticeable by other people. And half the time, it's not noticeable by us. Our heart rate increases, our blood pressure increases, which puts us at risk for some other potentially serious things. Our blood is going to our muscles and preparing our body to fight, so we might feel more agitation than we normally would. And finally, for some people, if the stress is there for long enough, we actually find ourselves feeling as though we're shutting down. We're not able to take in information and respond to our environment in the way that we might otherwise need or be able to. Oh, I've lost my ability to move hold on one second. Here we go. So this is some pretty scary stuff when you think about, or let me go back here. The good news about this slide here is that these are very quick automatic responses that come on very, very quick and go away very, very quickly. So the minute I park my car and can get into the doctor's office and say, I'm here, I'm sorry, I'm 15 minutes late, and they say, no problem, have a seat, my stress response, which was very elevated, is immediately going to start going down. And it's really not done any harm to my body in the big picture whatsoever. The problem comes in when we're exposed to toxic stress or we're exposed to situations that keep our stress system working for an extended period of time, right? And so that can be a number of different things. The things that make this really bad for children in particular is that it can actually start to disrupt the way their brain develops. So rather than if you think of a child who grows up in an environment where they're feeling unsafe on a frequent basis, you're going to see changes in the way their brain develops and the way their biology develops, so that as they go through the world, they're going to be more likely to pick up on threats in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise been. For grown-ups that are experiencing prolonged periods of stress, we know that it actually can be predictive of a number of different types of chronic diseases, and any number of diseases, and it can actually lead to an earlier death. The good news is that, especially when we think about children, the ability of a single adult to come in and be a voice of reason, to be a kind listening ear, to provide support, can, I don't want to say 100%, but can do a really, really important job with regards to buffering the negative impact of stress on children. Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about adverse life events? So sometimes when we started doing these presentations a long time ago, not this presentation in particular, but presentations on trauma in general, what we found is that people had different ideas about what could be traumatic and what couldn't be. And so, or what tends to be traumatic and what doesn't tend to be traumatic. So we have these couple of slides in to get us on the same page. Um, Highly stressful adverse life events, not only for children, but especially for children, are represented at the bottom of this page, right? So these are things that can lead to very short, or I'm sorry, these are things that can cause a very high level of stress for an extended period of time, resulting in some short-term sustained difficulty. So this might be a child moving homes or moving schools. This might be a child who's having to have some sort of medical procedure. Parents going through a divorce. Divorce is usually disruptive and highly stressful for everyone in the family, and or the loss of a loved one. When it's someone, especially that we know is getting older. We've got the example of a sick grandparent up here. All of those things can be very highly distressing situations that can impact functioning for both kids and adults for a short period of time. But they are usually not going to have a traumatic impact on children or families. On this slide, though, are a number of situations that are often experienced as traumatic. So we'll go from left to right: neglect and or abandonment, physical and sexual abuse, sudden or unexpected death, children who are taken away from their caregivers, who are, by DCFS because their caregivers are no longer able to take care of them. They may be abused, they may be neglected, but sometimes just the separation from the caregivers on top of the abuse or neglect has its own degree of trauma associated with it. Automobile or other serious accidents, community violence, domestic violence. A refugee is the idea that we have to leave our country of origin because there's a threat to our well-being or our safety. So oftentimes people with refugee status are likely to experience traumatic stress symptoms. On the bottom line there, terrorism, violence, and war, disasters, or in our recent case, the pandemic, a life-threatening illness or a medical procedure, and then the big purple box, which is what we're talking about today. And that is the idea that ongoing, that is a key term in this box, marginalization, discrimination, or, that really should be an or, not an and, or violence based on any aspect of identity, we now know, and I say we know because we finally have the research, but there are people that have known this since the beginning of time, that when folks are experiencing marginalization, discrimination, or violence based on any aspect of their identity, the likelihood is that they will go on to experience that as traumatic in the same way they might experience one of these other boxes as traumatic. But it's not something that we've given a lot of attention to until probably the last decade. So when we say aspects of identity, what is it that we're talking about? Well, this slide has six examples, but there's many more that we could put up here. The reason we chose these six is because they're some of the most observable and some of the most frequent that people experience the marginalization or oppression or discrimination. So race or ethnicity, religion, immigration, gender, ability, disability, or sexual orientation. Every single one of us on this call today can look at each of these boxes and try and figure out where we fit within them. And we'll all come up with some different beautiful combination of characteristics, and many that are not represented on this page. But I think the thing that we keep in mind here when we think about identity-based trauma is that some of us are at much greater risk of experiencing marginalization and oppression, and it has to do with how often we're fitting into a majority group versus a minority group. And then the word there at the bottom, intersectionality, that's simply trying to recognize that those of us that walk through the world with a number of different types of minority statuses are at even greater risk of having some sort of marginalization or oppression based upon an aspect of our identity. So now we're going to talk about biases. And biases have gotten a bad rep, if you will, right? People walk through the world now and they're like, I'm not biased, right? The truth is that we are. All of us are biased. Having biases is a function of our brain. It's something that our brain does to take care of us. It allows us to move through the world in this very quick and efficient way. I'm going to get my words up on the page here so that we can talk about it. So one way to think about biases are just as being an important mental shortcut, right? So something that we do, again, to save time and to save energy. But the other special thing is about biases is they're different than just putting people into categories or putting things into categories and knowing how to do something automatically. A bias is when we have a positive or a negative association with a particular category of people, places, things. It can be just about anything. Biases are oftentimes unintentional and out of our awareness. And that's why I think we walk through the world and we want to say, no, 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 I'm not biased, right? I'm an objective observer. Because biases are not something that are chosen. Rather, there's something, ooh, excuse me, I'm sorry. There's something that form over time from our various earliest exposures to the world. As we're trying to learn about people and places and things around us, we're taking in all of the information that is handed to us, right? From what our parents say to us, from what we observe at school in the classroom or from our peers, from what we see on TV or in the radio, right? One thing to keep in mind about biases, as helpful and as effective as they can be for getting us moving through the world in a way that doesn't exhaust us, is that they're rarely accurate, right? Because anytime that we try to take a person or a type of people, a place or type of places or certain aspects of things and put them into a category of good or bad, we're often finding ourselves incorrect because there are so many small nuances that play into each and every expression of whatever category that thing is. And the other thing about biases is that sometimes we accept them as truths, even though they're inaccurate and they're just kind of ideas and beliefs that we have within us. So this is a really fabulous short film made by Procter and Gamble. It's called Widen the Screen. You can find it by searching Widen the Screen on YouTube. And it really does a good job of displaying how sometimes our biases have a way of settling in within us. So I'm going to go ahead and play this video, and then I'm going to pass it off to Dr. Millsaps to pick up from here. So here we go. I'm going to try and mute first and see if it works.
If you think you know what happens next, ask yourself why. These are the black stories we've been shown. A narrow view that limits our understanding. But there's so much more to see. The full picture of black life. Let's widen the screen so we can widen our view.
Thank you, Tracy, for showing this video. Powerful reminder of just how sometimes the things that we experience and even the information that we take in from media can shape what we think we know and believe about other people. And so I'm curious. Oh, thank you, Kimberly. I was going to invite everyone to, if you're comfortable, or those of you who are comfortable, to just share in the chat maybe some of your immediate reactions to the film. Um, but the media does play an important role in what we believe about people, especially people of color or people from various identities, right? And so let's reflect a little bit about what biases we might think about when we reflect on each of the scenarios in this film, right? So we think about the young man in the car with a bag going up to the door. What bias do you think this scenario might be addressing or challenging us to kind of take a step back and think about? And if you're comfortable, you can drop that in the chat. What bias do we think the film might have been trying to address? Maybe dealing drugs? Absolutely. Being a drug dealer? That because of maybe how he looked, he might have been up to something unlawful. Absolutely. What about the young woman with the baby in the grocery store, outside of the grocery store? What bias might this film have been trying to address or challenge? Young mother with fatherless children? Absolutely. And what about the other scenario with the kids in the convenience store? What bias? Yeah, stealing. Burglary, absolutely. And so, oftentimes the biases that we hold are often accepted as truths. And so what we want to do, even when we think about our roles at your various organizations and the systems that you interact with, um, what biases might we hold? And it's important to take a step back and begin to reflect and think about those things. Because one of the things that I want to point out, and Tracy, would you be able to advance to the next slide for me? Is the idea of minority stress. So there is a theory of minority stress, and it's a model that highlights the fact that there will be experiences, there will be stressors that are part of everyday life for people based on their social position, based on their identity, whether it's related to their gender, whether it's related to their sexual orientation, whether it's related to their race, that they will experience stressors that are insidious. And what we mean by that is that they are subtle, they are cumulative, they are constant, and sort of they build over time. It's repeated exposure to these types of stressors, which may include things like discrimination, prejudice, oppressive victimization. And what's unfortunate about minority stress is that many people with minoritized identities go through life and move through the world and don't even recognize it, right? Because it's been such a regular part of the existence for individuals since birth. And so not even recognizing it, not even thinking that, hey, these are the types of experiences that people should not experience or should not endure, but they do. And there are often significant health outcomes that come along with that. And we'll touch on those later. But what we want to be mindful of, and we can go to the next slide, is that if we take this idea of being marginalized and unpack it a little bit, we're really referring to the act of treating a person or group as though they are insignificant, pushed to the margins of society, rendered powerless. And I want you to really hold on to that word powerless because it's going to come up again later. And then certain identities based on the biases that we hold, the beliefs and values that are held, put people at risk for marginalization. And this chart from Culture Ally really highlights For us, just some examples. So if we think about a particular demographic, whether it's gender, whether it's race or ethnicity, whether it's ability status, someone who may not be marginalized or fit into a marginalized group might be a man, okay? It might be someone who is heterosexual or who does not have an disability, excuse me, or who is white, but someone who may be indigenous or who may be Black or Asian or bisexual often fall into this marginalized category. And so, if we think about this, I want to encourage you or invite you to think about the agencies that you work with or the organizations that you are part of and ask yourself who will fall into these marginalized categories. If we look at these demographics, gender, ability, race, sexual orientation, who within my organization will fall into this category? And then ask yourself, okay, how might these individuals be impacted? Because marginalization is often resulting in disempowerment. And I pause because I think that's a really powerful word. And I want you to, if you have a notebook or a piece of paper, just write it down somewhere, highlight it, write it in red, because what we're talking about is access to fewer opportunities or resources. And the options that may be available are often less quality. There are fewer examples of people who look like you, people who are represented in positions of power. People are often portrayed in a negative light, and the perspectives or priorities are not of interest or not valued. And this is so important because this is part of feeling safe. You know, it's one thing when we talk about physical safety, right? But there's another thing when we talk about psychological safety. And so that felt safety comes part of that from when you feel like your perspectives and your priorities are valued, are of interest. So I want you to think about the question presented here and how does this show up in the education system in the United States? How does this marginalization or being disempowered show up? And if you're comfortable, I invite you to share in the chat. How does it show up in the educational system? Fewer resources? Absolutely. The neediest schools tend to have the highest turnover of staff members, which over time traumatizes kids. You know, less diversity in rural areas. So it shows up in a number of different ways. So it shows up in a number of different ways, right? Thank you all for sharing. And we won't have time to look at all of the responses, but feel free to look at the chat of ways that this can show up. Next slides, please. And what we know is that sort of this marginalization and being disempowered happens when people are treated differently, when people are treated unfairly. And so if we think about discrimination, this is what we're talking about. The unfair or prejudicial treatment of people and groups based on characteristics like race, like gender, like age, like sexual orientation. And so, you know, if you're thinking back to your organization and asking yourself who will fall into this category and how might they be impacted by this harm, right? Next slide, please. And one more. So discrimination can show up in many, many different ways, right? So it can include racism, ageism, It's harmful. It doesn't matter whether it was intentional or not. There is harm that results from discrimination. The other thing to think about is the fact that it can be subtle. These can include slights, jokes that we kind of brush off simply because everybody does it, everybody says them. It can also be more overt. So these can include things like bullying, verbal aggression, physical violence. And it can not just occur on a micro level. Okay, so when we think about these microaggressions, these little slights, these little insults, but can also be embedded into the very policies and practices that we're still operating from today. So on a macro level. And so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. And so when you ask yourself, when you think about your organization, your agency, your school, your classrooms, are the youth that I'm working with, are they exposed to these subtle slights and jokes? And if we think back to minority stress and sort of this cumulative wear and tear, this insidious type of walking through life or moving through the world um, in such a way, hopefully we can sort of feel the magnitude or the weight of that, right? So I want you to think about that as we continue. And it's also important, and we can go to the next slide. It's also important to note that these types of unfair treatment are recognized regardless of your age. So even very young children are aware of being treated differently based on one or more aspects of their identity. They may not always um, have the language to describe what they're experiencing. They may not have the cognitive processes, depending on where they are developmentally, to make sense of it or to put it in words, but they feel. They feel. It can impact how they think about themselves. The older a young person gets, it can put them at increased risk for suicide, adopting really unhealthy coping strategies because they're trying to manage, they're trying to cope. And we often hear a lot of times, oh, that children, especially young children, are resilient. They don't remember anything. They'll get over it. But I really want to challenge those thoughts or those ideas or those notions because in some ways it absolves us from having to address it. So if we think, oh, they're children, they'll bounce back, they're resilient, then that takes pressure off of the adults. And if we think about the social contract that we have as adults with young people, we have a responsibility to address it. But when we think, oh, they won't remember it, then it kind of takes a little bit of the pressure off. But I want to challenge us to say, yes, they feel they're impacted by it. And so let's take a look at a video that really just highlights that even young children internalize biases.
Anderson Cooper, AC 360, CNN weeknights 10 Eastern.
There are lots of different colors for skin.
I have questions for you about these pictures of different children.
After I read the question, I want you to point
To the picture that fits the story.
Are children colorblind in America?
show me the smart child.
Show me the mean child.
Can you show me the dumb child?
Show me the nice child.
Is bias measurable even at an early age?
Why is she the bad child?
Because she's black.
And why is he the ugly child?
Because he looks like he's white.
Why is he the dumb child?
Because he has dark brown skin.
Why is she the bad child?
Because she makes fun of everybody else's skin color.
How much do kids learn from what they see and hear from adults?
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like.
And show me the child who has a skin color most adults don't like.
These are questions that we, along with CNN's Soledad O'Brien and a team of psychologists hired by CNN, spent months investigating through tests, interviews with children and their parents. But they're questions that have been asked for decades. The first doll study ignited controversy in the 1940s when psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark pioneered studies in the effects of segregation in schools by asking African American kids to choose between black and white dolls. The so-called doll test found black kids overwhelmingly preferred white over black. Those results were at the center of the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, that desegregated American schools. Now, with the first African-American president and nearly 60 years after segregation was overturned, we wondered, where are we today? How do kids see differences in race? What we discovered might shock you, but first, how we got there.
Skin color, child skin color estimation.
Okay, yeah.
We asked renowned child psychologist and University of Chicago researcher Dr. Margaret Beal Spencer to design a pilot study for CNN and analyze the results.
Our children are always near us, because we're a society. And what we put out there, kids report back. You ask the question, they'll give you the answer.
Spencer's team tested more than 130 kids in 8 schools with very different racial and economic demographics. Half of the schools were in the North, half in the South. Oh, nicely done. Well, the country is much more diverse today than in the 1940s. The children in this project are from 2 age groups and 2 races, white and black, to better allow comparison to the original doll study. 4- and 5-year-old children were asked a series of questions about these images. 9- and 10-year-old children were asked questions about the same images, as well as this color bar chart. The tests led us to 3 major findings. First, white children as a whole responded with a high rate of what researchers call white bias, identifying the color of their own skin with positive attributes and darker skin with negative attributes.
Show me the dumb child.
Dumb child.
Okay, why is she the dumb child?
Because she has black skin.
Show me the mean child. Why is he the mean child?
Because she's brown.
Show me the bad child. Why is he the bad child?
Because he's black.
Okay. Show me the ugly child. Why is he the ugly child?
Because he's brown, black.
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like. And show me the child who has the skin color most adults don't like. Show me the child who has the skin color most children like. Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like. Show me the child who has the skin color most girls want. Show me the child who has the skin color most girls don't want.
The questions that got overwhelmingly white-biased answers?
Show me the dumb child.
About 76% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the mean child.
About 66% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like.
Again, about 66% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the bad child.
More than 59% of the older white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones. But some white children did have more race-neutral responses.
So could you show me the good-looking child? So what are you thinking? I know you pointed to them all, but tell me what you're thinking.
I'm thinking that I do not care if they are black, white, mixed, or any kind of race. I think that it matters who they really are.
Thank you. I'll pause for a moment. But I would like to invite you all to share any immediate reactions, thoughts, or feelings to this video. I know some of you started sharing as the video played. Heartbreaking, sad, difficult to watch. A lot of children learning from the adults is resonating with people. The heartbreaking comment stood out to me because I'm reminded of my time in school and, having these types of conversations and watching similar videos and people just expressing, as a student at the time, feeling sad and feeling really, really challenged by it. And my professor saying that we should be sad, we should be heartbroken, and that these types of stories and experiences should continue to break our hearts, because the minute that we stop feeling we kind of separate ourselves from the call to action or to address it because we don't feel a need to. So we should be heartbroken. We should be sad, right? So if we take a few seconds to just kind of breathe and check in with ourselves and ask yourself, how are you doing? How am I doing? And if there's an emoji that you want to drop in the chat, if you're comfortable that expresses how you're doing, feel free to do that. But it can be a lot to take in. Yeah. Harsh reality. I'm just taking note of some of the responses in the chat. Absolutely, media does not help. Yeah. And so we have some work to do. We definitely have a lot of work to do. Thank you. I'm seeing some emojis, yes. So we want to continue to feel when we witness things like this, and we may observe things in the classroom, in the building, school building, in the community, and we may observe things that make us feel sad, that break our hearts. And when those feelings come up for us, when we notice things, that's a powerful reminder that we are very much human and we are compassionate about the things that others experience, especially when they're harmful. When they're harmful. Thank you all for sharing. I am going to hand it back to Dr. Fehrenbach. Thank you all for sharing. Yes, kids are teaching their peers this too. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Millsaps. I was just so engaged with the chat and what people were putting. Thank you for
Yes.
your thoughtful responses in there. There was one response that stood out in particular, and I'm going to come back to that in just a second. So we're just gonna we're 2/3 through our presentation, so thank you for hanging in there with us. This section is titled The Impact of Stress and Trauma on Children with Minoritized Identities. So again, a minoritized identity, as we're focusing in on, can definitely be race. It is one of the most observable aspects, but there is a ton of different types of identities that children carry with them as they move through their school day. So feel free to share, if you want to point out examples other than race, because we are trying to keep our minds open to everything. But because racial discrimination in particular has been so prevalent and so damaging to our communities, we do want to make sure that we pay special attention to it. So the first we want to do is quickly remind folks that toxic stress, so this exposure to ongoing, even small types of discrimination or oppression, whether intended or unintended, does build up over time. So that's what the drops are on the top side of the page, and they can eventually start to spill over. The toxic stress that results leads to problems within children and adults with regards to the way our cognitions work, so the way we think, our ability to access our creative minds, emotionally and behaviorally, it can result in a dysregulation, which all of you as folks who work in the school district are probably well aware of. When kids are moving through their day and trying to learn when dysregulated, not only can it make it hard for the classroom, but it also makes it very hard for them themselves to learn. And that is what the research is telling us. So there's not a tremendous amount of research out there. And we just shared with you, when you look at race, and discrimination, or identity-based discrimination more general than race, in the younger children, we see studies like the one we just saw. But when children get a little bit older, we can begin to ask them specifically about times when they might have felt like they themselves were marginalized or discriminated against. And that's a couple of the bullets here. So there are several studies when combined that tell us that by adolescence, if you ask a child and have them rate, to what degree they have felt discriminated against based upon some aspect of their identity, you see those kids that have felt more discriminated against are more likely to be anxious, to be depressed, to begin to use substances, and or to engage in risky sexual behavior. So the take-home message for me is that when young people live their lives having aspects of their identity that they have no control over, that they're supposed to be proud of and supposed to be kind of embracing, judged critically by others over time, that really settles in and really makes well-being a difficult thing. And it may come out in one way or more. The study there in the bottom that says perceived discrimination is also associated with, that's a study with several hundred 9 and 10-year-olds. So even at the age of 9 or 10, when we examine the amount of discrimination that a child feels as though they've felt, and these researchers are pretty savvy. They're not just sitting down and asking kids blatantly, well, how discriminated do you feel like you were, on a scale of 1 to 10? There are ways of asking these questions so that we're getting at what it is we're asking with a little bit more accurately. But for children who do perceive as though they've moved through the world and they've been judged or they've been treated in certain ways based upon aspects of their identity, they don't do as well in school. Their success is not as high as their peers in the same setting that do not feel as though they've encountered those difficulties. And then even more, or I guess equally concerning for me personally, is you also see a decreased motivation. So not only are they struggling more, which we would expect because their stress systems are being, they're on alert when they shouldn't be, because learning is not, we don't learn best when we're stressed out, but they're also learning, they're also kind of giving up a little bit more. They have less motivation to want to be in the classroom, less motivation to want to take in new information. And I'm suspecting that has to do with the fact that they're expecting to continue to encounter this negative feedback from the world around them. And that's probably settling in with regards to the way they think about themselves, the way they think about others, and the way they think about the world at large. Now, going back to the text real quick, there was someone in the text that said, or in the chat, excuse me, that said, do they even understand their answers? It seems so rote. And I think that that's the really tricky thing about biases, right? So we probably, if we asked that question and really sat down and talked about it, I bet we would reach different conclusions about different kids that we saw in the video. Some of them probably did understand what they were being asked, right? And responded aligned with what they think. Other people, though, other children may not have known. They may not have understood why they were being asked that. I mean, I think they knew what the question was. They understood the words being said, but the degree to which they understood the impact is different. And it's interesting. It made me think, if somebody were to take, I don't know, 20 teachers from those same schools and sit down and ask them, hopefully all of us would do what that last child did, which is to kind of hit all of the children. But the reality is that many of us have the biases underneath that we have to recognize and then kind of override. It's just that with children at that age, they don't yet have the world experience or the knowledge that tells them, I've been told that black is not as pretty as white, but I'm not going to express that. I'm not going to believe that. I'm going to act differently, even though that's the automatic bias that shows up in my brain. Racial trauma. So it's interesting. I have focused in on the study of trauma since 1997. And I have been trained in how to do comprehensive trauma assessments. I have worked with people that have experienced traumas of all races and ages, and it's kind of at the center of what I do and always has been. But it wasn't until about, when was George Floyd? When was that? When did he pass? 2002, 2001? It's been within the last handful of years that our field of psychology, even those of us that study trauma within psychology, are catching up to this idea that traumatic stress isn't only tied to all of the blue boxes on that slide I showed earlier, but that we really have to give some legitimacy to the fact that sometimes people can experience trauma as a buildup of all of the small things that happen over time. So this term racial trauma has been in the literature fairly recently. There was an entire journal article, our entire journal, dedicated in 2019. It was an APA, American Psychological Journal, that was published that had a series of articles on racial trauma. And so that's where this definition comes from. Racial trauma is related to either real or perceived experiences of racial discrimination, including harm and injury, humiliation and shaming events, or witnessing harm to others. So sometimes you can have a racial trauma response by watching what is happening to another person. So even if I myself have not been the target of identity-based oppression or discrimination, if I belong to a community that is, then I can begin to kind of take that in and feel the stress up to the point to where it actually turns into what we might term as racial trauma. So racial trauma can be directed, like I said, as an individual at a group or to a group to which a person belongs. Racial trauma tends to be ongoing and the impact builds over time, just like toxic stress does. And then more and more research are coming out. We've got a 2019 quote here at the bottom, but this is a topic that continues to be debated. What we've learned up until this point is that PTSD, which I'm assuming most of us have heard of, post-traumatic stress disorder, is a certain thing, and racial trauma is kind of its own thing. So it is very, very much related to PTSD, but unfortunately has this very special aspect to it. And I'm not sure that we fully understand why yet, but when you stop to think about it, PTSD can be caused by a car accident or someone getting attacked, right? Something that happens to us, something bad that happens to us by chance. Whereas racial trauma or any identity-based trauma is really intrinsically tied to something characteristically about us that we cannot separate ourselves from. So when we are damaged or hurt or abused in a way that is tied directly to our identity and the way we move through the world, it is something special and something very, very adverse, resulting in something similar to PTSD, but maybe even worse. Erica, I think it's back to you, right?
Yeah, thank you, Tracy. So let's look at a video that talks a little bit more about racial trauma, and we'll hear from a few experts in the field. And as the video is playing, just make a note of anything that stands out to you, or please feel free to share any immediate reactions you have as well. Thank you.
Racial trauma isn't just something that Black and Brown Americans experience regularly. It's something health experts say they're born into.
What makes it traumatic is how you experience it.
Similar to PTSD, racial trauma, or race-based traumatic stress, is the collective effect racism has on an individual's mental and physical health. It can be from major experiences like workplace discrimination or hate crimes, or it can be the result of an accumulation of many small indignities called microaggressions, or system or institutions that enforce structural oppression.
There was a national survey done by the American Psychological Association, and about 25% of all African Americans, 30% of all Native Americans report at least one of those experiences at least once a week.
The APA says not only do Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian American people significantly suffer from racial trauma, but that it can also compound with additional oppression based on gender or sexual orientation.
It depends on the intensity and the frequency of how often you experience racism or how severe the event is, but you might start with just race-based stress. So something will be racist and you'll be exposed to it and you'll feel stress, but racial trauma is really when it has those long-term effects. It really sticks with you.
Immediate symptoms can include increased heart rate or blood pressure, heightened cortisol levels, sweating, or tension in the body. Long-term chronic exhaustion and fatigue are among the most common symptoms.
Just sadness, underlying or overt anger, even thinking differently about yourself. So sometimes believing or starting to endorse those stereotypes that people might have about your racial group. If you're experiencing racial trauma, you might have some of that internalized racism.
Increased hypervigilance, the having the nightmares or flashbacks, avoidance of situations where they may, perceive it as threatening. All of those are consistent with what we find in race-related stress and PTSD. And so there's a lot of overlap.
Kind of, bouncing back and forth between that and numb, and never really feeling safe and socially connected and supported. And that also affects your brain and how your brain develops.
America's healthcare system impacts racial trauma too, making it more difficult not only to find help, but someone who understands a patient's experience. A 2015 study found that in the US, 86% of psychologists were white, 5% were Asian, 5% were Hispanic, 4% were Black. Meanwhile, some of the experts we spoke to are setting out to help. Dr. Candace Nicole Hargens released Black Lives Matter meditations for racial trauma victims and white allies.
Black Lives Matter.
Therapist Kelly Baker has helped organize Facebook Live videos with her local NAACP branch where anyone can connect to learn more about racial trauma. She's included sharing her own experiences.
I don't think you can say that there was ever a time for me when I did not, that I was never exposed to racism. When I think about my family, my mom, my grandmother, and the things that my mother experienced that were clearly racist definitely affected how she parented her children.
What can be done to respond to racial trauma? Dr. Erlanger Turner tells Newsy adding an official diagnosis of racial trauma to the DSM-5, an encyclopedia of sorts for mental health professionals, is not the solution. He suggests racial trauma's existence is something everyone should be aware of, especially healthcare providers and policymakers.
If you are white, you do need to make sure that you try to understand that person's experience, that you provide some sense of solidarity, that you don't apologize. I think people oftentimes want to apologize in these situations, and that's really not helpful. We need solutions. And so I think that is one of those things that we have to do better and make sure that we take ownership.
Lindsay Thies, Newsy, Denver.
All right. You can pause for a second or two, and I see some comments in the chat already. Yes, post-traumatic slave syndrome is a real thing. Dr. Joy DeBruy, awesome. Intergenerational effects, yes, racial trauma. There's historical trauma. There's intergenerational trauma. Absolutely. Yeah, very sad. Yeah, so we kind of see that these are experiences that are real experiences for people based on their identities. And so I want to invite you again to think about your organization, think about your school. If you are working with students directly in the classroom or either indirectly, think about the types of experiences that they may have had or may be having based on one or more of their identities. And we concern ourselves a lot of times with certain behaviors, certain challenges. And so depending on our demographics, we should not only be asking ourselves, what is this young person's story, or what has happened to them, or thinking trauma. We should also be thinking racial trauma, right? We should be thinking about the communities that they're a part of, the home environment, the things that their families experience. Remember, we're talking about this sort of insidious type of stress, this cumulative impact on both a micro and a macro level. And then when they show up for school, we expect them to be perfect model students. Or we expect teachers to also be regulated, because as professionals, we are also coming to the environment with our experiences, right? If you think back to one of the stats that was shared in this particular video, that on average, a Black or brown person might report experiencing one racially traumatic or discriminatory experience per week. I think that might be a bit conservative, but these are things that we kind of have to bring forward a little bit more and talk about a little bit more and not sort of sweep under the rug. We might ask ourselves, is this young person feeling safe in this particular classroom with this particular teacher or with these other students if they are the only student of color or they are the only student who may have a disability? And so how does that identity-based trauma show up for them? And how are we prepared as professionals to address it, to provide that support? And I'm seeing some other responses in the chat. Yeah. Generational. Yeah. Once a day, depending on where you live. Yeah, you absolutely can experience discrimination or other forms of traumatic experiences based on your identity once a day. Absolutely. And again, we're saying this takes a toll. So, Tracy, if we can go to the next slide, let's look at how racism can affect child development in particular. But this is a really powerful resource developed by Harvard University Center for the Developing Child. And you have the link there, and you could go look at it. It's a little bit more extensive than this, but some of the things that we've learned is that prolonged activation of that stress response system can impact the developing brain. If we want to drive that point home, we need to drive it home, right? Because we're saying the children are our future, but what young people are experiencing today is affecting them, is affecting how their brain grows, based on what they take in and what they experience. And this constant wear and tear impacts their learning, it impacts their physical health, it impacts their mental health. Someone shared earlier in the chat that, young people are becoming unalived based on the things that they're experiencing. Research also shows us that there is a relationship between this chronic activation and wear and tear to racism. And we have to acknowledge it, no matter how uncomfortable it is. And we have to think about, okay, how do we address it? Because essentially we're talking about, Black and brown people, on average having more chronic health conditions compared to whites, regardless of income levels, economic status. And so there's more to the story, right? And so how do we think about all of this in light of the work that we do, regardless of your role in the educational system, in the systems that you engage with? And so let's just take a little walk down memory lane and just look at inequity in education. And we can go to the next slide and kind of unpack this a little bit much. We won't do a deep dive, but if we think about Africans in America, indigenous people, Chinese immigrants, Latinx, all of these individuals have experienced inequity in education. Historically, formal schooling was only available to a certain group. Wealthy, elite white people. Historically, Africans enslaved in America were not allowed to learn to read or write, and there were often swift and harsh consequences for doing so, right? Indigenous people of America were stripped of their land, forced to be confined to reservations. Schools were segregated and eventually forced into boarding schools where they were stripped of their identity, their culture, their language, their customs, their rituals. And when you think about the times of immigration for Chinese, we had anti-Asian exclusion laws, right? That only allowed a certain amount of individuals to immigrate. And, there was no schooling, right? So Chinese families often homeschooled because when they attempted to enroll their children in schools, they were barred. Same thing for Latinx. sometimes they could slide in, but they were often barred based on their surnames, based on the color of their skin. And so we see this long history of segregation and unequal access to education and resources. And don't get me wrong, there have been Black schools and Latinx schools and things of that nature, but they didn't have the same access to resources. These schools were underfunded. They didn't have the same access to quality, to finances. Even when we think about the moments, right, in history, if we think about Brown versus Board of Education, major moment, many positive benefits from it. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, major moment, many benefits. No Child Left Behind, 2001, many benefits, right? But when schools became integrated, there was no support for Black and brown kids. They were thrown into environments where they were yet exposed to discrimination, bullying, violence, right? This unfair treatment on both a micro and a macro level. And we still continue to see these things play out today. And it's not that these things weren't helpful, but we just kind of stayed on the surface and thinking about the benefits of these things because none of these um, laws or policies or changes address the history or the legacy of the systemic and structural barriers that cause the inequity to begin with. And we still have not. And so my charge to you, my call to you is, to think about how you in your role can begin to make small steps forward to address some of these inequities. And it may be starting with the conversation. It may be, familiarizing yourself with the resources that are out there. And so where have these policies and some of these laws gotten us? Again, there have definitely been some positive outcomes, but we have yet to address the root causes, I believe, in a lot of ways. So if we look at the next slide, and we ask ourselves, where have the policies gotten us? Well, about 10 years ago, we still saw that the graduation rate for white students was 87% compared to 73% of children of color. Children of color were more likely to be expelled or suspended compared to white students. We've even seen preschoolers expelled, little Black boys, right? And so we kind of have to take a step back and ask ourselves, what is really happening here? Why is this even okay? Children of color, 54% less likely than white students to become recommended for gifted programs and are often tracked to lesser programs, to special ed programs. We need a referral. Okay, but we need to take a step back to really assess, okay, what is contributing to the experience of this young person where we would even think that there needs to be a referral, right? Children of color are subject to lower expectations from teachers, and Black and Latinx students in schools today are also more likely to be in high poverty schools that are under-resourced. So my question to you for reflection, and please share in the chat if you're comfortable, is what factors do we think contribute to these differences still today? What are some of the factors that we think contribute to this? Continued bias, yes. Maybe a lack of trauma-informed care, home life. Yeah, they're probably a combination of things, right? There's also a sense of disempowerment because even if we think about the No Child Left Behind Act, it put the responsibility on district schools and teachers to address difficulties that kids are having, but through a prescribed way of doing it, through testing, through all of these things. And so I can imagine, and I used to teach many years ago, just the feeling of disempowerment that comes along with that, even as a professional who may be facing your own identity-based trauma in the environment that you're in. And we'll talk a little bit about that more next week. So hopefully you will join us. And so we see a lot of things, lack of being educated about their own biases. Yeah, absolutely. And so let's take all of this that we've been talking about today, and let's look at the scenario of racism in preschool. Right. So we're going to go to the next slide. And I'm going to read a scenario from you, and this is adapted from a case shared through Reddit. Um, and I'll just read it. But as I read it, I want you to jot down anything that just jumps out at you, anything that stands out at you, anything that concerns you. And then we'll have a few questions to discuss. But it says, we recently moved from a diverse city to a not so diverse rural area for my work. My son is now the only non-white child in his class. One of my biggest concerns about this move was how it would affect him. Everything was going okay until this weekend when he started saying the N-word. I asked where he heard this, and he told me from two boys at school. This word is not in our vocabulary, so I believed him. I almost feel like it's pointless to bring up to his teacher because if 3-year-olds are saying it, they most likely heard it at home, and nothing is going to change. It hurts that we are already being forced to have these conversations with him so young. I'm already looking for other jobs so we can get moved, not just because of this, but my son's happiness and safety is my number one concern. I spoke to his teacher this morning and she was very defensive, and I was surprised and upset. However, she called me this afternoon to apologize and explain. We had a good conversation and I feel better and hopeful. Next slide. So let's kind of unpack this a little bit. So how many of you, as I read through this scenario, did anyone write down safety as something that stood out to you that you heard? If you did, you could give me a thumbs up. But share in the chat, why is it important to define safety for children beyond physical well-being? I know we touched on it a little bit earlier, but why is this important to define it beyond physical well-being for children? So I see a few responses in the chat. It's important we should teach it to kids early. Yeah. Why is that important? Yes, mental health is safety too. And you all shared earlier some thoughts or concerns about whether or not the children really knew what they were responding. Yeah, so they can know how to get help or self-advocate. And sometimes outside of physical safety, young children, that's not something that everybody just goes around teaching about psychological safety. So it's absolutely important. And we could hear it in that mom's voice. I want to move, not just because of my job, but I need my son to be safe. I need my son to be happy. Did anyone notice the mom's concern about having to have these conversations? And I'm doing air quotes for those of you who can't see me, for a 3-year-old child. Did anybody kind of take note of that as you were listening? So my question is, how does early exposure to racial slurs alter the innocence of childhood, not just for children of color, but for all children? So how does this early exposure to these microaggressions, these racial slurs, these jokes, these comments, how does it alter the innocence? Yes, it normalizes it. It makes children think that it's okay. It can be harmful. Yes, absolutely. Early intervention, the earlier we can intervene and teach, the better. And it may even involve having conversations with parents, right? And so when you think about that, does a school have a responsibility to address language that comes from the home environment that we know can kind of trickle down in terms of how they're showing up in the classroom, how they're interacting with their peers, what they're doing on the playgrounds? Does the school have the responsibility? I see a yes. I see another yes. Yes. And then what should that look like? What does that look like? What are the conversations that are happening with administration and staff about how do we address this? Yes, absolutely. And then finally, if we think about, the teacher, the exchange that this parent had with the teacher, how could another conversation be used to sort of figure out a plan for future advocacy? So the first conversation didn't go so well. I'm seeing in the chat, yeah, it was probably an uncomfortable conversation, and maybe the teacher wasn't prepared. Maybe mom wasn't prepared. But then they had another conversation and it went a lot better. What do you think might have changed the teacher's perspective? Any thoughts about what might have shifted the teacher's perspective? Maybe she had a conversation or maybe they had an opportunity to reflect. Maybe the teacher thought about how they responded the first time. And that's why taking that step back and reflecting is so important. And feeling when we feel like we're not prepared to have a conversation because it's uncomfortable, it's okay to acknowledge that and say, hey, I need a moment. You know, yeah. The teacher's job to make sure the students feel safe, not to get defensive. Yeah. These are awesome responses that you all are sharing. And I wish we had time to kind of really focus on uh, quite a few of these, but unfortunately we do not. But you all are absolutely on target. Thank you so much for sharing. But as we continue to go, I'm going to move forward in the slides, but continue to share thoughts or ideas as they come up for you, and drop an emoji in the chat to let us know how you're doing. And we'll move on to the next slide. And I want to invite you all to just keep in mind that, even though this is challenging work, or it can be, we may not all have the answers. We may not always get it right. We may even come to the table with our own trauma histories, but to remember that we're all in this together and that we all share the burden. This work is relational, right? It's community work, it's collective work, or it should be. And that we may come to the table with our own privilege, whether it's related to race, our gender, our sexual orientation, our ability status. We should leverage and use that privilege. We should use our lived experiences and relationships with one another to move this work forward. And as you think about that, I want to invite you to identify one doable thing that you can commit to doing in the next week. It doesn't matter how small or how insignificant you might feel it is, or it sounds, or how simple it may feel to you or seem to you, but identify one doable thing that you can commit to doing in the next week as it relates to everything that we've talked about. And if you're comfortable, you can share it in the chat. If not, you can write it down, because this is sort of your personal, small test action step. And as you're sharing, I'm going to turn it over to Tracy. We have a few more slides that we want to highlight before wrapping up, but thank you for sharing in the chat. I'm seeing a lot of great things, and I'm sure folks won't mind if you borrow some things other people have shared that really resonate with you that you want to try. And I will turn it over to you, Dr. Fairpump.
Thank you so much. I was just going through the chat too. I applaud all of you. This is fabulous. You all are adding to this presentation, to this conversation. So thank you very much for doing so. I just want to reinforce what Dr. Millsaps was saying, especially with regards to using your privilege. You know, we were talking a lot about race today. I happen to be a person who moves through the world as white, right? So I don't carry any burden related to my race. And it took me a lot of kind of education to try and be able to understand that as a young person. I think that as a professional, sometimes those of us that don't carry a specific minoritized identity can pause and question whether it's our right, whether it's okay for us to stand up and take up space talking about an issue that doesn't necessarily impact us, or whether we should kind of get out of the way and stay quiet, you know, and quietly support the things that the folks that are most targeted are saying. And these are conversations that I've had over time with Dr. Millsaps and with a lot of other of my colleagues. And time again, you know, we're just really landing in the space of, it does take all of us to shift the reality that we're up against, right? It especially takes those of us that are in majority groups when we're raising our own children, when we're impacting other children. I mean, as you can imagine, if we've got children coming into our classrooms that have biases against a certain type of group, it may be a stronger message if the counterpoint comes from someone that they can relate to, someone that they see as part of their majority group. So, you know, in addition to thinking one doable thing, you know, I invite you to challenge yourselves, although the fact that you're here today is already speaking, and all of your chat in the text box over there is already speaking very clearly to the type of audience that we have. But, you know, challenge those around you, challenge your family members, challenge your peers. Like, we have all got to come together and do this work together. So here are just a few bullet points. I'm going to go ahead and put them all up there. Oops, sorry about that. So trauma-informed care, somebody put that in the chat. As you all know, in our next webinar, we're going to talk more about what we can do. We just got a little bit of a segue into that with the thinking about what we could do in the next week, but we're going to get much more into what trauma-informed care looks like in this area. We ask you to think about how important it is to honor differences in individuals' identities, not be colorblind, not pretend like everyone is equal when they're not, but really go out of our way to celebrate the differences and the diversities within human beings, whether that be in your classroom or outside of the classroom. The second is to just keep in mind, you know, that we make assumptions naturally. Somebody put subconsciously into the chat, I think, and that is accurate, excuse me. A lot of what pops through our mind about the judgments that we make as we move through the world are not part of our conscious awareness. So part of doing the work is becoming more aware. You know, what are the biases that I hold within me? When I walk into a room, or when I have a specific type of interaction, what are the ideas that are most likely to be automated that I'm going to have to see in order to override, right? And when we do make an assumption based on someone's identity, and that actually comes out of our mouth before we can catch it and say, no, that's not what I meant, remember that even with the best of intentions, it can do harm. Maybe an apology is helpful, and maybe it's not in the moment, but trying to do better most certainly is. The third bullet up there, constant exposure to even the small instances build up over time. It impacts our ability to think and learn, our physical health and our mental health. Unfortunately, we still have longstanding policies and a history of racism. I heard saw some of the commentary in the text box about the current state of schools today and what is happening within some of your districts. And then there are a multitude of ways that we as individuals and as systems can positively impact the school environment for all people. We want to leave you with just a couple of different resources. So this is a webpage of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. Our center is a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And as you can see along the top here, but it's a screenshot, so I'm not able to pull it down. You can get on and you can look at all sorts of different aspects of trauma. Within the past couple of years, we've had this beautiful page dedicated specifically to race-based trauma. And so we'd like to just draw your attention to it, encourage you to go and check it out, see what more you can learn, because this is most certainly an area where we should all continue to expand our awareness and understanding. This is another article that came out from the American Psychological Association, and it's talking about, from the very youngest of our children, what are the things that we can do or say that buffer them from the biases that they're otherwise going to pick up as they move through the world. So anti-racism is a word, I think, that is sometimes misunderstood, maybe not by people on this call, but it really is just the idea that we're going to do whatever we can to promote acceptance, right, and equity, as opposed to segregation and marginalization based upon the color of one's skin. And that really is it. So, if you have time in your day, we would absolutely love to invite you back next Thursday. We're going to be talking more about the strategies and the resources that can be used to increase the felt safety in the classroom. And when you try to engage with families about these issues, we're also going to explore the impact that this work has on staff well-being, and including specific strategies that we can do for staff wellness. So that will be same time, same place, but next Thursday. Thank you so very much. If you all want to reach out to us, please do. We would welcome ongoing communication.